on the which was filmed on the traditional lands of the Lower Elwha Klallam tribe to retell mythic stories central to Coast Salish tribes, while showcasing difficulties related to sovereignty, which tribes continue to face today. We feel privileged to have Ms. Renville with us this evening and look forward to hearing about what she discovered in her search for stories about her ancestors. A warm welcome to Fern Naomi Renville.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Ha mitaku yapi. Hello, my relatives. Take up these giant glasses. My name is Fern Naomi Renville, and I am Siseton Wahpeton. I am also Omaha and Seneca-Cayuga through my grandmother, Naomi Renville, Naomi Fremont Renville, and her mother, whose name was Melinda Cayuga. Melinda Cayuga was taken from her family as a 9-year-old child and placed in the Carlisle Indian boarding school. She left at age 16 when she ran away with my great-grandfather, who was Omaha. They returned to his Omaha homelands, and their union produced, among other children, my grandmother, Naomi Fremont Renville, who raised me, but in a Dakota community. So I am Dakota. I feel unequivocally Dakota. No question about it, no insecurity about it. But I have a much harder time feeling confident in my Seneca-Cayuga identity, because that is not a part of my heritage that I grew up around or was exposed to as a result of these dislocations and dismantling of families in the boarding schools. So, as a grown-up woman and theater director who has worked in New York City and whose ancestors are from that part of this land, I became invested in learning who my great-grandmother's people were, what her story was, the community she came from, and what my relationship to her nation is. And in discovering her story, I also discovered the story of what used to be called the Iroquois Law of Peace, but is now called the Haudenosaunee Law of Peace. That is the story that I am going to open with, because this is the story that was told to the colonists who appeared on this continent from Europe. So in 1776, there was this thing called the Continental Congress. Do you remember that from history class? And our quote unquote founding fathers came together at that Congress to form a new constitution. That Continental Congress was also attended by the Onondaga families that had advised this group of colonists and who had openly inspired these colonists. You have to remember that when the first colonists arrived here on this continent, they had had zero lived experience or exposure to either representative democratic government, didn't exist on the European continent at that time, or balanced power between the genders, gender equity and balance that was in place in Indigenous communities on this continent. So these things were completely new to the founding fathers. Now, that Onondaga family that I mentioned, they actually formally adopted Benjamin Franklin. And the reason why? They felt sorry for the colonists. Yes, They felt sorry for how the colonists couldn't collaborate and together collectively resist the power of the monarchy. They felt sorry for the colonists who were being ruled by some king on the other side of the world. So they advised them. And this is the story they began with. Now, this story that I'm about to tell you takes place in a time that was full of conflict and strife and great sorrow. Perhaps it was a little bit like this time. Well, we know from our stories that these times have happened ever since humans arrived. And so, in this dark time of war and conflict, the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee, now at this time there were 5, now there are 6 nations, but that part's for later. At this time, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Seneca, and the Cayuga nations all were at war with one another, even though they were closely related to one another and shared borders and rivers and had so much in common against their enemies. In spite of all that, these 5 nations could not get along. Now, into this dark time came a character who became known as the peacemaker. He was a sort of prophet who showed up in Haudenosaunee lands. I'm not quite sure where he came from, but they say that he arrived on the shores of what's now called Lake Erie, and that at this place, there was a sort of crossroads where all of these Haudenosaunee nations came together. And there was a woman from the Cat Nation who ran a sort of boarding house in a longhouse that was located right there at those crossroads. This woman's name was Chukusasa. And in this time of great conflict, they say when relatives were fighting relatives and women and children were afraid of men. Yes. In this dark time, in Chukusasa's lodge, there was peace. Yes, you see, anybody at all who needed a place to stay, a meal, could stay at Chukusasa's lodge. They had to leave their weapons outside the door and promise that they would eat a meal with whoever was inside, even if they were enemies. And this is what happened. So when this man who became known as the peacemaker arrived, one of the first places that he stayed and one of the first people he met was Chukusasa in her boarding house. Kind of like a hotel, I guess. And so this peacemaker was very impressed by how in Chukusasa's lodge, enemies broke bread with enemies and ate together with their weapons, no, not on them, not under her roof. And so this peacemaker traveled from nation to nation, sharing a vision of a peaceful, united Haudenosaunee Confederacy of a Mohawk, Seneca-Cayuga, Onondaga, and Oneida nations joined as one to be powerfully protective of not just the Haudenosaunee way of life, but against the strange new people who were beginning to appear in this land. And so, after many years, they say, of traveling around, this peacemaker had actually convinced the leaders and people of the Oneida, the Mohawk, the Seneca, and the Cayuga to join in talks to establish this peaceful alliance, to establish the rule of law that they would all live by. But the Onondaga would not join. The leader of the Onondaga was named Tadadaho. And they say that Tadadaho was so addicted to making war, to violence and murder, that snakes had started to grow in his hair. And he and his people had gone to live in the swamps. And nothing anyone said to them could persuade Tadadaho and his people to quit making war and join this Confederacy. And so finally, at last, the peacemaker said, maybe I should ask maybe I should ask Chakusasa for advice. Ah, yes, always a good idea. Ask a woman, especially a woman who has established her power to bring peace. And so the peacemaker sent messengers to Chakusasa's lodge and asked for her to join him so that the peacemaker could receive advice from her. Now, back at this time, it was kind of a big deal to go traveling. It wasn't as easy as it is now. And so Chakusasa must have thought it was very important to leave her everyday life and lodge and travel to go to where the peacemaker was so that she could consult with him. Now, when she reached this gathering where the peacemaker was and where his followers were all the people who really wanted to help him realize this vision of an aligned Confederacy, she said, "It's a good thing you asked me and asked me to come and see you, because just recently, every morning, I'm awakened by the birds outside my lodge. They've been singing this song, this beautiful, strange new song. And that song is stuck in my head now, and I keep hearing it. And now I realize why." And Chakusasa sang that song. And when the peacemaker and the others heard this song, they could feel its power. They could feel the power of this song to soothe angry, violent hearts. And then Chakusasa taught that song to the peacemaker. And they understood that this was a power song that had been given. And so the peacemaker and the others all returned to the swamp to confront Tadadaho. And once again, they asked him to join this peaceful alliance. And once again, he refused. And so now they sang that song. They sang that song, and they say that almost against his will, Tadadaho was drawn out of that swamp, and he came forward, and the humanity returned to his face, and the snakes fell from his hair. And the Onondaga nation at last joined this alliance. And to reward them for turning away from war and turning towards peace, the peacemaker promised that the Onondaga would always be the guardians of the sacred fire that stands for this alliance, that symbolizes this confederacy. And so at this time, the peacemaker and these people all shared this new law, like it was like a prophecy that was revealed not just to the peacemaker, but to all of these people present. This vision of every person having a say in their community, this vision of balanced leadership, of a separation of war leaders and peace leaders, a separation of elder leaders and youthful leaders, but balanced. All of these things at this time became what's called the Haudenosaunee Law of Peace. The longhouse symbolizes this law of peace. It symbolizes this construct, these laws that, even though they were given to us in vision by humans, they're natural law that come from our Creator. These are the laws that allow us to live peacefully and in good health together on this earth with all of our relatives. And so, at this time, this person known as the peacemaker dug a pit under the tallest tree that they could find, which was a white pine. The pit at the base of this tree was filled with the weapons. All of the Haudenosaunee people threw their weapons in there and buried them to symbolize that no longer would these nations fight with one another. And then the peacemaker took an arrow from each of these 5 nations and held them together and showed that together these 5 arrows could not be broken as a single arrow can be. And so the peacemaker, just then, an eagle came and landed in the top of that white pine tree. And the peacemaker said, "This eagle will be the symbol of our way of government, our law of peace. And this eagle can see far away, can see into the future, can be a guardian of our democracy." And if any of this sounds familiar, bunches of arrows, eagles on the top of trees. So then the peacemaker explained the system of law that the people were being given, in which all the villages would be led by clan mothers. The clan mothers are the grandmothers. The grandmothers, it was said, are the only ones wise enough, who've lived long enough. They have the experience to know who is a good leader or not. And so these clan mothers would choose and appoint the male leaders of the village, who then ran a consensus government inside the village under the supervision of the clan mothers. Only a clan mother could remove an appointed leader. Only a clan mother could pass a death sentence on a tribal member. Only a grandmother who had changed the diapers of an important man knew his true character, it was said. I love that particular piece because it completely reframes this intimate task of taking care of a baby. So at this time, the Haudenosaunee Law of Peace was established that allowed the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to live in peace for almost 1,000 years, to live and prosper. Now, a little later, the Tuscarora became a part of this Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but that is a different story. This confederacy of the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, completely inspired our founding fathers. In 1987, Senator Daniel Inouye introduced a resolution to Congress, and it was passed and it became law, or became part of the record in 1988. It was a resolution acknowledging the debt of the US Constitution to what was then called the Iroquois Law of Peace. And very importantly, it also acknowledged the obligations of the US federal government to be in direct sovereign government-to-government relations with not just the Haudenosaunee nations, but the other tribal nations on this continent. So it's a really important resolution. It's, if you go and Google it on the US Congress website, there's all this fascinating scholarship that was done by Vine Deloria Jr. And you can download it all. So the US Congress website is actually a treasure trove for research nerds. So this is not a story that I heard in the schooling anywhere, not in college, nowhere. It wasn't until I started doing my own research into my great-grandmother that I started to get a much clearer picture of how completely informed by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy our US government is. But because of that bias and lack of experience on the part of the colonists, the power, the social clout of Haudenosaunee women wasn't recognized or seen. And so, I mean, they saw it to some extent, but they didn't really understand. And whether they really understood or not, whether they had the political will to establish a truly authentic Haudenosaunee form of government that was led by women is another thing. But in any case, not something I knew, not something I was expecting to learn. And also so surprised every time I share this, most folks haven't heard this, including history teachers. And so none of this is controversial, by the way. This is all like factual. And Benjamin Franklin himself, in his own memoir, wrote about just this. So there's lots of primary accounts of this piece of our history. What's interesting to me is just how willing our culture has been to conveniently erase this knowledge and to view Indigenous women on this continent as somehow subjugated or degraded, when in fact, not just my Haudenosaunee ancestors were women who were represented in their governments and who held social and spiritual and financial clout in their communities. But my Dakota ancestors were as well. Now, the more I learned about my Haudenosaunee great-great-grandmothers, the more I was motivated to learn more about my own Dakota female line. Now, about 3 years ago, I also took a research class at the Minnesota History Center, which gave me skills and access to a lot of databases and historical newspapers. And I was perhaps not surprised, but I was gratified to see how clearly the same dynamic played out in Dakota territory. So Minnesota's the breadbasket of the country now, yeah. And Minnesota's farmers are, that's what the state is famous for. But Minnesota's first farmers were my great-great-great-grandmothers, the Dakota women who lived in villages along what's now the Mississippi River, in what was then called Imanaska or St. Paul, it's what it's known as now. So This, my Dakota ancestors were described in the public narrative. If you look through the newspaper coverage of Dakota women through a whole century, the only description of us is as the, once again, kind of the subjugated, degraded wives of, polygamous wives of Dakota men who were savage, barbaric, war-making, nomad hunters. Now, it's true that Dakota men did not hunt. Dakota men were not considered appropriate. Excuse me, Dakota men did not farm, pardon me. It was considered at that time that women, with our power to bring forth life with our bodies, also appropriately have the power to bring forth food from the body of Mother Earth. And this was a high status occupation to grow the foods for the people. Now, once again, the public narrative, the military narrative that's public, the newspaper coverage of my Dakota people always describe us as nomadic hunters, never as farmers. And yet, we had permanent planting villages along the Mississippi River in what's now the Twin Cities. My great-great-grandmothers sustained the missionaries, the fur trappers, and the military who first arrived in the Twin Cities, just as when the colonists had arrived on the East Coast. They would have starved, not just, if not for the game that men supplied, but all of the produce that the women supplied and which actually made up the bulk of the diets. The beans, the rice, the corn, the squashes, the melons. And so in the Twin Cities, in these villages where my ancestors grew mound-style gardens on the floodplains, and we lived in elm bark lodges on stilts in the summertime over these mounds. Our foods sustained the invaders, the settlers, and the receipts for that exist because the military and missionaries are very good record keepers. But publicly, they never said these things, only that Dakota people were savage, barbarian, nomadic hunters, and we weren't using the land. So there was a real cognitive disconnect and the total erasure of female power. So my great-great-grandfather, his name was Gabriel Renville, and he was the last chief of the Siseton Wahpeton at the time of our removal from the Twin Cities. And he was the signatory on the treaty that gained us our reservation in exile in South Dakota, the Lake Traverse Reservation. He was an important man who parlayed with the government. But the reason that he was an important man was that he had married important sisters. Yes, he married 3 sisters from the village called Kaposia. This village there in the Twin Cities was an important place because it was the center of the trading world on this river. And so these women married my great-great-grandfather. Of course, for the women at that time, to be married to one man multiply was not considered a bad thing. It was considered a desirable thing. It was considered that 3 women sharing the work of a marriage and children was a good thing. and made for a happier life. Our word in Dakota for mother and aunt are the same. It's ina. And to this day, Dakota people, we call our cousins our brothers and sisters because our family structure was radically different, but also radically misunderstood. Every bit of newspaper coverage of my Dakota ancestors, my great-great-grandmothers, paints them as these women who were invisible and had no power and were dominated by their husband, as if. I wonder how many men believe that they would have more power in a relationship with their wife and her sister or sisters. And so this power in Dakota communities that women held, our power was economic. We were the owners of our land and our lodges, not men. Women were the recognized heads of household. So if a woman were to divorce, a man would simply leave with just his clothes and nothing else. So my great-great-grandfather married these important sisters, and as the husband of these important women, was given the role of parlaying with the military and the missionaries. And so the history books are full of his name and don't even mention my great-great-grandmothers. Don't even mention the spiritual power that they held in their community, the economic power that they held in their community. And in this way, our power was invisible, was erased. Again, just like my Haudenosaunee ancestors. So this isn't really what I expected to uncover, but it has been very illuminating because the story of America is the story of power being taken from women. And this proposal, this topic, it's been like almost 3 years, if not more now, since I proposed this topic to Humanities Washington. At the time, all of the political upheaval that was going on drew me to this. But in the last couple of years, the intense attacks on female sovereignty that are happening right now in America are really making me grateful for my stories and for the history of female power that I keep uncovering here. Because it's really important and good to remember that on this continent, women historically held power in our communities, not power over men, but power balanced with the power of men. I have this tattoo on my arm. You can see it's a thunder beam. And it has this symbol. It's like an hourglass. That's called the inverted double lodge. The inverted double lodge is highly symbolic for Dakota people because it represents balance. Balance between the spiritual and the physical, between the male and the female. So Dakota people are told that we're supposed to live right here in that sweet spot, in that balanced place. And this is a story that I grew up with. Now, my Dakota stories, of course, I keep coming back to them because they also speak to this power that women have always held on this continent. So our Dakota women, Haudenosaunee women, are not gaining freedom for the first time. recovering and reclaiming a representative power that we held on this continent pre-contact. This is the story that my family taught me, and that Dakota people, this is like a primary story from our belief system and philosophy. It's called The Story of White Buffalo Calf Woman. Now, this story also takes place long ago in a very dark and conflicted time, a time when brother fought brother, and once again, women and children did not always feel safe with men. Now, in this time, two warriors were out hunting. They were out hunting on the prairie, and because some enemy tribal people had been seen, they were laying low. They were hiding behind bushes. Now, these two hunters were just hanging out behind these bushes waiting for an animal to come along, because they didn't have rifles, of course. They had arrows. And hunting with a bow and arrow doesn't involve chasing your prey. It involves waiting for your prey to come to you. And so these two warriors were waiting on the prairie when, from a distance, they saw a figure approaching. And as that figure grew closer, it became apparent that this was a woman. And as the woman drew even closer, they were a little freaked out to see just how beautiful she was. She practically glowed. And it was almost as if she were floating more than walking. She just glided. And so this mysterious woman, as she approached, one of the warriors said, "Ah, that is a sacred being. Clearly, this woman, all alone, unprotected on the prairie, is a sacred being, and we must pay respect to her." Now, the other warrior instead had bad thoughts, and he said, "Oh, I've never seen such a beautiful woman, and she is unprotected here." And this man, then, he stood up, and without anything more to say, he reached out as if to grab this beautiful woman. Now, as he reached out and grabbed that beautiful woman by her arm, a cloud appeared. A cloud enveloped the woman and that man who dared to grab her. And his companion, the other warrior who was watching, was horrified and amazed. And when this cloud dissipated, after just a couple of minutes, that woman was still there, that beautiful woman. But the man was not. That warrior who had dared to touch her was now a pile of bones that looked bleached as if they'd been in the sun for years. And coming out and slithering away from that pile of bones were all the snakes that now live on this continent. And so the woman said to that man, who was now, that man was the other man. He had fallen to his knees, and he said, "Oh, I am so sorry. You are clearly a sacred being, and I apologize for my companion. Please do not judge my people by him. I swear that the people in my camp are good, and they would never approve of what he was trying to do. Please, on behalf of my companion, forgive my people." And this woman said, "Stand up, don't be afraid. I can see that you are a good man. I can see that you tell the truth about your people. So go now to your camp and tell your people that I am coming to see you in 4 days' time, and that I am bringing you a gift. I am bringing you a special gift." Yes. And then that woman turned and walked away and disappeared. And that man returned then to his village and shared the story with the whole camp of this mysterious woman and her promise to visit in 4 days. Well, clearly the people knew that this woman was sacred, and so they carefully prepared for her arrival. And in 4 days' time, there she was on the horizon. They could see her approaching. She appeared wearing a beautiful white buckskin dress again. But this time she was also carrying something in her arms, a bundle. The woman walked into the camp and into the big center lodge where the people gathered. And that woman went to the headmen and the elders and said, "This is a gift, a sacred gift from our Creator. And I give you this gift. I give this gift to the Dakota people. This gift comes with ceremony. And if you keep this ceremony and honor this ceremony, the Dakota people will thrive and be well and be connected to our Creator." And the woman opened up that bundle, and out of the bundle, she took the first pipe. It was in 2 pieces. She placed them together. The body of the pipe, a bowl carved out of something now known as pipestone, the blood of the earth, the blood of the people. The woman said, "This bowl represents the blood of the earth, represents women, represents the beings of the earth. And this stem carved out of wood with eagle feathers carved into it. This represents the things of the air, the power of men." And she joined them to balance them. "This represents the power of earth connecting to spirit." And then the woman took out the sacred herbs that she placed into that pipe. And she showed the people how to smoke that pipe, how to pray with that pipe, how with the smoke to send prayers to the Creator, to feel close to our Creator. And this woman taught the people the ceremonies, the 7 ceremonies that Dakota people were to keep so that her prophecy would come true. And it's true that Dakota people have kept these ceremonies. My father, my brothers have kept the Sundance ceremonies, the Hunka ceremonies, all of the ceremonies of the Dakota people have been preserved and are still practiced now more freely. Up until 1974, it was actually illegal. And so these ceremonies, we never forgot them. They had to go underground sometimes, but these ceremonies have survived, and so have the Dakota people. Now, this woman, once she had given this pipe and the ceremonies and sacred herbs to the people so that we would have the power to keep ourselves connected to creation, to balance ourselves with the spiritual, she said, "I will return in all the 4 ages of humankind." This is the first age. "In the final age of humankind, a time of great difficulty, I will return and I will bring the spirit of enlightenment with me. Keep the ceremonies." And she also said at that time, "Men, you must remember that the power of women is equal to the power of men, and it is your work to protect women, for women are the life givers." And so at this time, this woman, now she rolled on the ground. And when she stood up, she was no longer a beautiful woman. She was a golden buffalo calf. And she rolled on the ground again. And she stood up, and this time she was a red buffalo calf. And she rolled on the ground again and stood up. And now she was a black buffalo calf. And one last time, this woman rolled on the ground. And when she stood up, she was now a white buffalo calf. And this white buffalo calf disappeared back to the east where she'd come from. And even though they have not seen her since, the Dakota people have kept her ceremonies, kept her ways. Now, this story taught to me by my family, by my elders, and embodied in our ceremonies is a powerful story, especially for now. So to be able to share this ancestral story with my audience in a time when the female power of women has been erased and the struggle to take power away from us over our bodies, over our right to representative government, to have a voice in this country. That power is under attack. And so I'm grateful for this story to be able to share it and share its power. And the reminder that we live in a time of prophecy. This is what I tell myself. I live in a time of Dakota prophecy, when the spirit of white buffalo calf woman will return to bring balance and enlightenment into the world. So thank you. At this time, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to ask you to please share any reflections or questions or anything you'd like to at this point.
Well, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about how you've learned all these stories and sort of a little bit about the research and how you have uncovered all of this information. I would be interested in the various sources and where you learned the stories. I know you said that your ancestors have carried down these stories from the Dakotas, but tell us a little bit more about that.
That's a good question. And this journey of becoming a storyteller of my Dakota stories is not unique to me or Dakota storytellers. All of us come from people, and people have stories. We all come from cultures that have stories that are either explicit, we know them explicitly, or they're more in the background and we've kind of disconnected from our own cultural mythic story traditions. But those stories are there. So as a Dakota person, I have been privileged to be exposed in my own family to both storytelling and then to artistic traditions that highlight and celebrate storytelling. So powwows, dancing, that's a form of storytelling. And all of our Dakota dances literally have stories that go with. So growing up as a Dakota person in what is very much still a strong oral culture, I have been extremely fortunate to have absorbed a lot of those stories literally from my family. However, I do not actually come from a family of artists. My family are brilliant people, but I was supposed to be a midwife or a lawyer. And instead, I wanted to make stories and plays and sing songs and dance on stage. And I grew up to become a theater director. And theater, modern theater, is literally has roots in Greek religious pageant. So back in the day in Greece, the first acting companies were telling the mythic religious stories of Greek culture for religious festivals. That is literally the root of modern theater. and it is the winter lodge tradition of Dakota people. So every winter, since time began on that cold, snowy prairie, Dakota people, after the hunting season ended, would go into the winter lodges, and an assigned elder artist would begin and tell the stories of the Dakota people, our origin story, how we came to be, all the stories that tell how we are in relationship with every other thing, and what our obligations and responsibilities are, and what our how to be a good Dakota. So those stories are largely still alive because they weren't respected by settlers. So when we were relocated to the reservation after our forcible exile, there was a very short list of things that Dakota people were allowed to do. We could no longer sing, dance, hold ceremonies, not publicly in any case, or have dances, but we could tell our traditional stories. That was considered something that was safe, along with quilting and singing religious gospel songs. Those stories weren't really feared or respected by the missionaries or military at that time. And the funny thing is our stories are literally embedded with so much knowledge and history. And so it's really ironic that the reason I have had so many Dakota storytellers to teach me these stories is that the settlers that took away ceremony, song, and dance didn't think that traditional stories were any threat to white supremacy, basically. So in 2017, I was the director of a theater company in Seattle called Red Eagle Soaring. And when Standing Rock happened, I felt a powerful draw to leave my role as an administrator and return to my role as an artist. And so I left my position there and started to spend more time in my homelands connecting with the people who could fill in all my gaps. And believe me, I have plenty of gaps in my learning and knowledge. So I have some ancestors who are very well-known, renowned storytellers. And, reclaiming my Dakota story arc and story tradition has drawn me back to the Twin Cities to connect with that land there. So I spend a good half of the year these days in Minnesota because my stories, pardon me, my stories literally tell the relationship that I have to those places. So I had to go and seek and find people who identified as storytellers who were willing to share them. Of course, all storytellers want to pass on storytellers or to pass on stories. And this has all changed me. Learning more stories, having a more complete understanding of who I am culturally, sharing the stories has changed me in a powerful way. So I am such an advocate at this point for turning towards your traditional stories. And everyone has traditional stories, even if you don't know them right now. And go digging, go look, go find the people, the libraries, the books, the historical archives. American Indians on this continent are probably the most documented humans around. And so if we're looking into Native history, the resources are just, I couldn't get to them all in my lifetime. the government, the church, and the military all kept incredible, everything's in triplicate. So.
Thank you. We have another question here from Kath, who says, where does the Iroquois Confederacy fit in? I was taught in public school in New York State about the Iroquois. Thank you for sharing your stories.
The Iroquois Confederacy is the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. That's just Haudenosaunee is a more contemporary identifier that Haudenosaunee people are using ourselves because it's more authentic. So Iroquois is actually a French word that was attempting to pronounce a Haudenosaunee word. And so increasingly, Haudenosaunee people are using that word to self-identify. It has been a process of reclaiming the right to self-identify. So I grew up in 1960s South Dakota, where I was called an Indian or maybe Sioux if someone was feeling respectful to me. But I've gone through this whole process that all Native people have of reframing and thinking about how we identify and refer to ourselves in our own language and our own words, which is really an important part of becoming visible.
Are you finding that the young Indigenous, your youth are interested in reclaiming their culture? Is there a big movement for the youth to understand their culture?
So very much. The youth are leading the way. You may recall that Standing Rock was actually a movement that was started by a youth group, literally changed the face of activism in America. And back in 1961, 1970, on Alcatraz, those Native people who took over, one of them was my aunt, who was 18 years old. They were 18, 19, 20-year-old college students. So young people have always been leading the way, and today's young people are just amazing. Of course, our young people today have all of this accumulation of knowledge and wisdom and the means to share it and learn it with social media and the internet. So there's definitely a beautiful sort of acceleration of reclaiming of knowledge that the young people are getting to experience right now. And that's a beautiful thing.
So Anne, Jane had two questions. First, one was, I've been to Wahpeton, Minnesota on the Red River. Is that your ancestral home?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Mm-hmm. That was an area where we had our summer lodge, and in the fall we would hunt there. And then in the winter and spring, we would be in what's now the Twin Cities. So our living room and our bedroom was kind of like encompassed the whole state.
And she also commented, the early colonists wrote down these stories, but wrote out the role of women. Did your ancestors write the stories down as well, or were they oral traditions?
They were oral traditions. However, there are so many non-Native people who come from a tradition of writing who at the time documented and wrote about this. I should also say that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's, the mother of suffragism in the last century, was also formally adopted by an Onondaga family who mentored her because they felt so sorry for the women of that day and how little power they held in their colonial villages. So where was I going with this?
talking about oral traditions versus anything written. Yeah.
Yeah, but absolutely the power, I mean, these two stories that I shared with you this evening are both really powerful primary stories that touch deeply on the mythic origins of Haudenosaunee and Dakota people that speak to female power. And what I've discovered is that every Indigenous storytelling tradition has stories of female power. And I include Scottish and Irish stories in those too. So my mother is Scottish, and I have been more recently really enjoying the Scottish story tradition, which are relatives to the Dakota and the Haudenosaunee stories. Now, these stories don't always make sense up here. They're not linear, they're not intellectual. They tap into some other part of our consciousness. And because they're not asking us to be analytical, our bodies kind of relax and we kind of hear the story emotionally. So these stories are alive and where was I going to say? I was going to say that these stories are all related, and that they're speaking a kind of dream language that doesn't make sense up here, but always makes sense here. And I've been kind of stunned, literally, like Scotland has Finn McCool, who's the world's greatest liar. He's a trickster. And he's so much like Iktomi, the shapeshifter trickster of Lakota Dakota story traditions, or Anansi, the spider, or Coyote, or Raven. So these characters are kind of archetypes, and they're all related to one another.
We have two more questions right now. One, Nancy is asking, do you have any recommendations of what we could read to learn more about this?
To learn more about storytelling specifically?
Yeah, or the role of the empowerment of women in the tribes, or something along that line. What have you found that you've read that you really think that we should read?
Well, I really like the document that Vine Deloria Jr., who was a brilliant Dakota scholar, wrote for Congress to persuade them to pass the concurrent resolution. And if you Google that, you can find that online.
And what is it again?
It's called, just do Vine Deloria Jr., concurrent resolution, Iroquois Confederacy. Yeah, just those keywords.
Yeah.
But I have actually not seen the book that exists that has been that kind of covers this history. And that's not to say that I'm the world's most well-read person and I've read everything out there. But the knowledge isn't really in a textbook, or like there are some magazine articles that are out there that are really good. There have been dissertations that touch on this, but there isn't a kind of accessible presentation of this knowledge that would be good for like dispersing to educational settings or sharing widely. But let me tell you that Humanities Washington has actually committed to working with me to create some curriculum around this that would be just very free and accessible for everyone in Washington State or beyond, and that would be part of contributing to Since Time Immemorial, which is it's absolutely got a constructed framework, but it is also crowdsourced by teachers. Since Time Immemorial is the Washington State tribal sovereignty and history curriculum that all Washington State students now have to have in order to participate, which is beautiful, and which is also, there's nothing else like it in the rest of the United States.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
We have another question here, a little bit off the topic, but please tell us how, this is from Victoria, please tell us how you feel about the present day relationship Indigenous peoples have with the buffalo in Canada and the United States. What are your thoughts on the Buffalo Treaty? Do you feel the bison are returning?
Well, the buffalo are returning. the numbers are absolutely growing. That said, without ongoing intervention and support from humans, buffalo are still a threatened species. So our commitment has to be consistent and strong. Now, Dakota people have a very specific and special relationship with the buffalo. We're told in our stories that the buffalo come here and are given to the earth specifically to feed people. It was to make the world ready for people, because the buffalo sustained all life on the prairie. So yes, the buffalo are returning. My tribe has a herd, and so do all the Sioux nations now have our own herds. My tribe's herd is now big enough that every tribal member can have 40 pounds of buffalo meat a year, which is significant. And that's really important for especially people who live on the reservation and who are living in basically what are called food deserts and suffering from lack of access to fresh foods and traditional foods and close by foods and healthy foods. The health of the buffalo, our Dakota people depend on it. So we depend on the health of the buffalo in the same way that coastal people depend on the health of the salmon. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, interesting. And Victoria also had a question. Would you ever consider reading the Mishomi's book by Edward Benton Benet? Are you familiar with that book? The Mishomi's book?
No, I am not.
Well, that's...
I used to read so much. And when I turned 40, I actually committed to being less of a bookworm and to live life more instead of reading about it.
Somebody else, Leon, just left an interesting note here, which I'll read. I am Irish. Listening to your stories, I reflected upon the vision I had of the Banshee the night my grandfather died, a woman of great beauty and compassion. As my grandfather lay dying, he told me that he had also seen her the night his mother died. It was my father who told me that she was Banshee to our family line, our protector. I had no idea of who she was when I saw her. I just felt the message she gave me, the kindness of her eyes. She appears to us to tell us of the death of a beloved member of our family. So that is a story from his family.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that.
Yes. So thank you so much, Fern. I think we are about ready to conclude. Unless anybody else has any other questions, it's time to, unless you would like to tell us a little bit about the movie that you is being produced based on your play. We'd love to hear a little bit about that, and then we'll close.
Right before the pandemic, 2 weeks before, or 2 weeks after the lockdown in Seattle started, I was directing my first ever musical that I had written and was being fully produced by Sound Theater and Taproot Theater. And we had a sold out opening night. A beautiful set had been built. My cast was rehearsed and ready to go. And we had music and it was going to be wonderful. And then lockdown. And so after I suffered through a period of feeling sorry for myself and being depressed, I picked myself up and I decided that we needed to keep working on this. And so this beautiful group of theater artists transformed into audio artists, and we rewrote the script to turn it into a purely audio play, and we recorded the whole thing, including the sound effects and everything, at home individually in our own spaces with recording equipment. And then our stage manager, who had no experience in this, edited it all together. And so she produced it, and it was her first audio production that she produced. And she did just a beautiful job. The actors, none of us had ever done this kind of audio work. And everyone just, did an amazing job. So at first, this was kind of like a consolation prize. But then when we finished it and it was released and I heard it, it really was its own beautiful thing. And I was so proud of us and so happy to be a part of it. And then the amazing thing that happened after that is that once a story is kind of loose in the world, then other people see it and they have their own relationship with it. It's like having a talented child who goes out into the world and you can just sit back and watch. Can't quite take credit for it. So a deaf filmmaking group, Howie and Kyle Seago and Melina McKay, all turned the audio into a movie, and it's filmed on the lower Elwha lands and river up near Port Angeles. So it's just a gorgeous setting, and 2 deaf actors sign at the whole piece, the whole movie, and really push the visual vernacular that signing artists use. So typically a ASL interpreter is moving their hands, but pretty much standing still. These guys are actors, and they're brilliant actors. Now, stage actors, we have something called the visual vernacular. It's the story that you tell with your body, the nonverbal storytelling. And the stage, that's really where the storytelling is. So these 2 actors played 6 characters with the use of makeup and clever camera editing, and did such an amazing job that the final product just blew my mind. I could have never imagined that the script that we wrote would become this amazing film and a vehicle for deaf acting and storytelling. And it's currently traveling around to film festivals now, and it just won the local sightings prize at Northwest Film Forum. So I'm just amazed. And it's called Changer, a Hand Telling. Yes. You can watch it online right now. Please do so. It's just amazing.
And then Victoria wanted to say something more about this Ms. Shomi's book. She says it's a traditional Ojibwe way storytelling book. And she said, sadly, most non-Ojibwe readers have not heard of it. So she's hoping that we will all consider reading it.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Fern. It's just a pleasure for all of us to get acquainted with you. And we thank you for sharing this rich, interesting story of our land and something that we all need to know more about. So, and thank everyone here for attending tonight. We hope you enjoyed it, and I wish you all a good evening.
Thank you all. And thank you, Humanities Washington.
Thank you, Humanities Washington. All right. Good night.
Good night, folks.